Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. This is Maria Bringelmeyer. I'm the Senior Knowledge Management Specialist with Youth Power Learning at Making Sense International, and delighted to have you all join this webinar. Before we get into the topic of the day, which is analysis of cognitive and psychosocial pathways leading to empowerment and radicalization, are these two sides of the same coin. I will just give a little introduction to Youth Power Learning, since I know we always have a few people who don't know Youth Power Learning yet. So just very briefly, Youth Power Learning is a USAID funded project, a 5-year project that focuses on positive youth development. And the way that we have defined positive youth development and the way USAID has defined positive youth development is that we focus on making sure that youth have the assets that they need, the ability to leverage those assets, so the agency, the ability to contribute to positive change for themselves, and an enabling environment. So those 4 components are really the key components as we define positive youth development. And the components of the project itself are obviously focused on knowledge management, knowledge sharing, learning, and connected everything with positive youth development. We are sharing resources, events, information, and you can certainly help us share some of this information by sending them to us. We have a What Works section in different sectors regarding positive youth development. We have developed indicators, so you can use those indicators for measuring positive youth development on your project. You can also contribute to the positive youth development learning agenda. If you're a member of one of our communities of practice, you will have seen a request for input, and you can engage with the communities of practice. And it is thanks to the community of practice for youth in peace and security that we have today's presentation. It was the work of that community of practice that created the concept note for one of our grants, and our grantee, Equal Access, is presenting today on their first deliverable. So with regard to grants, we have awarded 10 grants so far on positive youth development and cross-sectoral youth programming, on gender transformative positive youth development, and in particular this one on youth civic engagement in effective peace building or countering and prevention of violent extremism. And currently we are reviewing the applications from the Young Women Transform Prize. So this is just kind of the brief introduction about Youth Power Learning. The grantees that were awarded under the Advancing the Evidence Base for Youth Civic Engagement in Effective Peace Building, or CVE-PBE, are 4 grantees. The United Network of Young Peace Builders, who is doing a youth participatory research project in Afghanistan, Libya, Sierra Leone, and Colombia. AMSS in Mali, who is doing a research on comparing 2 regions in Mali, one where youth is not affiliated with terrorist groups, and another region where they are more highly affiliated with terrorist groups, to try and understand what the differences are and why. The Eurasia Foundation of Central Asia, that is doing a review of 10 years of youth programming and effective peace building to see what can be learned from the evaluations and the successes of these projects. And then Equal Access, which we are delighted to have as a speaker today, whose studies focused on radicalization and empowerment, reframing human potential to strengthen youth civic engagement in northern Nigeria. And the two speakers that we have from Equal Access is Kyle Dietrich, who is the Global Peacebuilding and CVE lead from Equal Access International, and Mike Nikonchuk, who I probably mispronounced now, who has worked as a consultant on the study. And with that, let me hand it over to Kyle, and welcome.
Thank you, Maria. Well, great. It's great to be here. As Maria said, I'm Kyle Dietrich. I work with Equal Access, managing and leading their global peacebuilding and what we call transforming extremism portfolio. So this discussion today fits within a research project that we're wrapping up under the Youth Power Learning, thanks to our partnership collaboration with Making Sense International. Also on the line, you're going to be hearing from shortly is Mike Nikonchuk, as Maria said. So Mike and I have known each other for, well, probably 10 years, but really about a year. He's a senior researcher at Beyond Conflict's Innovation Lab for Neuroscience and Social Conflict. I won't give his full bio. He also went to Tufts, where I went. He went to University College London. But so most importantly, Mike he was worked with Questscope and different groups to support and focus on neurobiological and behavioral impacts of stress, trauma, and social networks, and how these concepts ranging from neuroscience can inform interventions to reduce violence, division, and healthy coping in times of stress and perceived threat. So Mike and I have been talking for the past year to really conceptualize this research. There's a third team member who's not on the call today named Chitra Nagarajan. She's based in northeastern Nigeria, where she's been for probably 6 or 7 years, and she led the second phase of this research, which I'll talk about in just a moment. So just for context sake, Equal Access International has been implementing CVE, what we call alternative narrative and social cohesion media programs in northern Nigeria since 2014. Initially launching a Hausa language TV channel called Arewa 24 that reaches tens of millions of viewers across West Africa, funded originally with counterterrorism, counter-violent extremism funding. It was a TV platform designed to fill a void in Hausa language, kind of Hausa culture, and also to create inclusive narratives looking at changing attitudes, behaviors, and social norms around violence, tolerance, respect, and diversity. And so we launched this, and this TV channel has since become commercialized and privatized, so it's a sustainable venture in northern Nigeria. But what we really wanted to do was look at how we could create an entire ecosystem of alternative messaging, alternative narrative content in the context of northern Nigeria and the Lake Chad Basin. And so we launched another radio program. When we were doing the research for that radio program, which is called White Dove in English, we kind of hit on the thesis behind the research we're talking about today, which, you know, talking to hundreds of people across northern Nigeria, getting a sense of what they want to hear about when they're looking at and listening to content that reflects them and their visions, their lives, and how to better their communities. There was something about CVE program that we saw and they told us was really missing the mark. And that was this idea that we need to look at radicalization differently. We have very kind of Western constructs that tend to be quite dehumanizing and alienating, which hinder long-term success of rehabilitation and reintegration programs, kind of marginalize communities, and definitely neglect the potential assets of individuals. And so when we were looking at designing new radio and TV content as part of the CVE messaging hub, we started to think, how can we reframe radicalization in our work and in our outreach? And so, you know, talking to people who have, you know, counter-normative views that have been dehumanized by a counterinsurgency, we looked for opportunities to not, you know, further dehumanize them, but to find ways, even if it's controversial, to create a space for these radicalized individuals, ex-combatants, what many people call terrorists, to be looked at in a different way, in a more human way, in a more inclusive way. And we thought this was a critical component to creating the context in a divided society for these individuals to be rehabilitated and reintegrated, and also be empowered in a way that taps into their assets. Again, going back to this positive youth development approach. So we shaped this research, and we really tried to look at our own role as an organization. You know, how are we perpetuating kind of a binary and often unhelpful paradigm that are really at the backbone of a lot of CVE work. So it wasn't just pointing the finger at others. We tried to be self-critical and say, you know, we're missing an opportunity by not directly engaging with these individuals. Too much CVE, PVE work, in my opinion, has historically focused on prevention and countering, and I think now we're starting to hear and see more of a focus on intervention and direct engagement. Obviously, there are legal and ethical kind of hurdles, particularly for U.S. funded organizations, but our research, first the desk research which Mike led, and then the second phase of the research, which Chitra and her team led in northeastern Nigeria, took advantage of this opportunity to talk to 15 or 20 Boko Haram members, ex-members, radicalized young people, to test and validate some of the concepts that we're going to be talking about in a little bit. And that report, the Phase 2 report, will be out in, I think, 2 or 3 weeks. So in our work, we talk a lot, CVE in general and equal access specifically, we talk a lot about shifting narratives. But again, we need to look at what are the meta-narratives that we're perpetuating, and do we recognize not only the grievances of individuals, but also the assets and their visions of radicalized individuals? Do we as implementers and extensions of Western governments recognize our contributions to conflict dynamics? We talk a lot about do no harm and conflict sensitivity, but the way the CVE field is constructed often perpetuates an unfair bias against certain groups, and we think denies some of their assets and talents. And so, kind of rushing through, because Mike's going to talk about a lot of this, when we talk about assets, that overlap these spaces of empowerment and radicalization, and we say, are these two sides of the same coin? We look at things like commitment and agency and self-efficacy and leadership and healthy group bonding and attachment. These are things that we see demonstrated across radicalized individuals and across empowered individuals. And so we kind of broke this down as these are sort of benign processes that arguably have different value systems and obviously different goals, but we can learn from them and tap into these assets if we really want to design programs that are empowering and strive to reorient individuals from, let's say, a space of violent radicalization to a space of positive, constructive, civic engagement or empowerment. And so our work has begun to do this for the past year to really reframe radicalization and then to look at how we can reorient radicalization to not only prevent it, but in a sense re-radicalize. This is this sort of provocative approach that we've toyed around with. De-radicalization as an approach is largely untested, unproven, originated mostly around denazification in post-World War II Germany, but it's not an approach that I think is the right one in a lot of senses. And so how can we reorient, or we said re-radicalize in some instances, by taking a more neutral and objective look at the construct of radicalism or radicalization, not as an inherently negative or an inherently violent process. As a side note, I'm an empowerment coach and facilitator, and so I kind of have been doing this with individuals and organizations, and was fascinated as we got into the research to see all the different parallels between empowerment and radicalization. That's kind of how a lot of this came about. So a quick note about the Phase 2 of the research. Since Chitra is not joining us, we might do another webinar. The report will be available probably next month. So, how, not only through the desk research, but testing these ideas with individuals aligned with armed opposition groups, widely referred to as Boko Haram in northeastern Nigeria, was what we wanted to do. So not just a desk research, but identify these individuals and really assess the cognitive and psychosocial dimensions and the overlap between the concepts of empowerment and radicalization on the lives of these individuals in northeastern Nigeria. So that research specifically looks at kind of 4 things, which is the radicalization journey broadly, but it talks about the journeys to association or engagement, the experiences of these individuals within the groups, their journeys to disassociation, why essentially they disengage from these groups, and what were their experiences after leaving the group. And the goal is really to create practical recommendations for development and CVE practitioners so that we can understand and really leverage kind of their insight. For example, a lot of people join because they're looking for meaning and belonging. We know this. A lot of people join because they're looking to live in an ideal society. They want to belong. They want to feel powerful and change the world. Well, then we have to ask, are these opportunities widely available in other kind of constructive social spaces in northeastern Nigeria, and what are we doing to create them? If people are largely radicalized in a group setting, are empowerment, CVE development programs sufficiently incorporating a group-based approach? When we look at CVE, the answer is no from what I've seen. But anyway, so all these findings are really to be examined and leveraged, and we're going to help, we're going to work to make our program stronger around CVE and social and behavior change communication. But then it's also, I think, hoping to advance the field, the CVE field, which is obviously not going anywhere. So with that, Mike, I'm going to hand over to you. Mike was our lead researcher on this first phase of the project. Mike, if I missed anything with your bio. And as I said to Mike before the call, these are not conclusions or hard and fast things that we're putting out there. This is to open a discussion. And so I invite Mike to disagree with us, and we will disagree with each other. And likewise, we invite your comments at the end. So thanks, Mike. Over to you.
Thank you, Kyle. I hope my audio is clear. We were having some technical difficulties earlier. But thank you very much to Kyle and to everyone who's listening in. This was a very interesting project to work on, one of the more provocative and intellectually challenging things I've done in a while. Kyle and I talked a while back about the notion of what are these two issues of empowerment and radicalization, two words we hear so often in this space. What do they have in common? And the advantage of approaching this from a neuroscience lens, is really that there's far fewer basic human motivations than there are human behaviors. So there's behaviors that look vastly, vastly different from a normative perspective, from a social acceptance perspective, that might be stemming from some similar or shared motivations. I mean, in the most far-fetched example, you could imagine a young person in a place like Jordan, where I worked for 5 years, who's a deep advocate of the Sustainable Development Goals and of pro-democracy and of women's empowerment and all these issues, and he carries these in protests and with deep passion. The outcome for him would be that he would be invited to multiple UNICEF-sponsored or other group conferences because they deserve to have their voice elevated. Yet there's young people who have a similar deep commitment and motivation to much more counter-normative or less ecumenical things around religious practices or around, social norms and mores. Yet there's something similar about what drives those two people in terms of what drives young people to be committed to any cause. And so while the outcomes may look very, very different and the treatment of those individuals in society would be very different, there's certain things that we can learn and glean from understanding the motivational framework that underpins behaviors of any direction that involve increased commitment and increased sort of compliance to a rigid set of ideals. So we started this by trying to understand both empowerment and radicalization as, sociological phenomena. As from a cognitive science perspective, we'd call that an agent-environment interaction. We kind of circumvent the nature-nurture argument by admitting that, of course, it's both. With any psychological or psychosocial behavior, we know that there's a tremendous influence of both individual difference factors in the brain and mind, and also environmental factors. Most major researchers in radicalization extremism admit that. Both empowerment and radicalization are what we would call psychosocial states. There are objective indicators, things that you can measure, litmus tests to see how empowered someone is or feels. And same way with radicalization, you can look at norms and different political, ethical views, commitment to cause, etc. And then there's subjective conceptions that underlie both. You can have individuals that are objectively high socioeconomic status, yet feel deeply, deeply isolated and disengaged from the system. And those are subjective components of empowerment that matter in terms of the ultimate feeling of being empowered. Same with radicalization. You can have someone who on paper seems quite radical in their views and beliefs, yet they would never consider themselves that, perhaps because they're in a context of a highly conservative religious environment, or they're in a place where their radical ideas are not necessarily counter-normative. I even think of, left-wing millennial activist spaces that myself and many of my friends occupy. There's quite a acceptance of radicalism. So in our analysis for approaching both of these topics, we really borrowed a lot from social psychology and neuroscience, partially because that's where I sit and invest my time. But really we wanted to use those lenses to try to understand how brain processes, how the way individuals think, and how social behaviors are influenced by different extrinsic factors in the society, by systems and structures, and also by individual motivational factors. Let me switch slides here. So first we dealt with the issue of empowerment. There's a vast literature on this topic, as there is on radicalization, so we did our best to summarize some key and quite disparate theories and scholarship on this topic. In looking at different theories, including Zimmerman, Paulo Freire, Forrest Tyler, obviously Search Institute's developmental assets framework, we looked at several different common elements, including all of them do emphasize an agent-environment interaction, the fact that there are individual change components as well as external factors that facilitate an empowerment journey. All of the different theories of empowerment hold agency as a central concept, but not just building of agency as a set of internal assets or abilities, but also as the performative aspect of that. That you can build capacities and assets, yet empowerment is not necessarily experienced or felt tangibly without the performance of that agentic capacity. In other words, empowerment is almost inherently linked to seeing that empowerment manifested in desired social change. Thirdly, groups played an incredible catalytic role. It was much more difficult to find any empowerment frameworks that said empowerment is an individual process. It was very, very clear that empowerment is something that's facilitated and exacerbated and catalyzed by participation with a like-minded group. And lastly, empowerment does encompass some individual awareness, some sense of the self as being a different individual than you were before. Naturally, a lot of empowerment theory comes with important criticisms, and these are not to be taken lightly. Of course, a lot of empowerment literature does imply that there is someone who has the ability and the role of conferring power, so in that sense it commodifies power, whereas, critical theory would try to decommodify empowerment and social power, looking at it more as a discursive phenomenon. Secondly, naturally, a lot of empowerment literature does seem to place the burden of action on the empowered individual, which can be seen as a way to avoid dealing with structures and systems that are oppressing those individuals. And that ties into the third point around the criticisms, which is that there's many, many programs that focus on youth empowerment that are specifically and exclusively focused on empowering young people without addressing any of the systemic factors that are leading to their disenfranchisement and disempowerment. Yet there's many approaches that do at least, recognize the fact that you can't really get too far with young people's empowerment if you're not dealing with the structures that are perceived as being disempowering. Now, radicalization was a bit more of a boogeyman. It's very, very difficult to define, and it's like a little eel. Every time you pinpoint a definition, it kind of slips away and something else comes up. Both empowerment and radicalization are processes, which means that they do have a start point and they do have different developmental phases, as do youth themselves. Importantly, it was very clear in all of our research that radicalization is inherently linked to social context. Again, you see the word radical being used to define a wide spectrum of individuals. We hear it in activist spaces here in the US. We hear it in governments talking about the actions of purely insurgent groups or ideological terrorist organizations. Naturally, the use of the word radical is linked to power structures. There's a risk there if it's linked to power structures that radical, because of its negative connotation in common parlance, can be used as sort of a cudgel to intimidate or to garner public support against nonconformist or non-normative ideas and movements. And naturally, we now increasingly in the past 10 years are not seeing the word radical or radicalization used much outside of the context of violent extremism. Extremism as a term was not too different from radicalization. It was very, very difficult. There's a lot of circular logic that goes on. So a lot of the definitional problems that we see in radicalization, we also see in extremism. There's so much cultural conditioning that goes into the use of both of these terms, extremist and radical. However, there's many examples of positive radicals that we see throughout history, and this is why we cited Alinsky in the piece, because he does have a really interesting framework for exploring the positive impact or potential positive impact for social change of radicals. Importantly, and this is a point that I really can't overemphasize, there's a tremendous distinction between the holding of radical or extremist views and committing violent or extremist actions. There's a book, I think 2010, Dan Kurtzman, called The Missing Martyrs, that was quite formative in my understanding, or helped me really understand this topic. Looking at Pew data and different public opinion polls from areas of the world that are considered to be quote-unquote hotbeds of extremism, you do see a tremendous support for what look like quite radical views around things like apostasy, women's rights, the role of foreign organizations or democracy, etc. Yet the number of actions taken that are in line with those extremist views are much, much lower than the actual professing of the belief. So there's definitely separate cognitive and behavioral components around radicalism that need to be taken into account. And it's that shift from cognitive to behavioral activation that is really frustrating for researchers, because we know that there's many people that hold quite radical views on different social issues or anti-system beliefs, yet they don't move towards action. So there must be something more than purely lack of opportunity or fear of reprisal. There must be something else that is driving that distinction. So continuing on that note of separating radicalism from violence, there's a really common point that was made clear right away in the research, that radicalism and empowerment are both processes that do include, to a certain degree, seeking and gaining agency with dedication to a specific cause. A lot of youth programs do try to rally youth around different pro-social outcomes and causes, whether it's an advocacy campaign or whether it's a social change campaign. Even social entrepreneurial approaches to youth empowerment do tend to have a cause component to them, and we seek to catalyze youth's collective action around specific causes. And in that sense, the process of gaining assets and issues to perform those assets against is common in both empowerment and radicalization. Importantly, radicalization is probably uniquely and more so related to a narrow and intensifying motivational framework. That is linked, yes, to opportunities, to influences, and very importantly, relationships and the pathways that are open for practicing that agency. If the pathways that are open to you for practicing a new sense of being an empowered individual or a change-making individual are nonviolent but non-efficacious, it's not going to be that attractive. Whereas if you have pathways that are maybe against some of your beliefs or norms but are quite efficacious in terms of achieving social change, it's going to be a different balance and calculation in terms of which one you ultimately choose, because the ability to perform your new agentic selfhood does require it doesn't always stand up to norms and beliefs. That if there's an opportunity to practice a new sense of power that's quite counter to your beliefs, it's not necessarily automatically going to be disqualified, because the search for agency is a tremendously powerful human motivation that does trump norms and ethics in certain contexts. Radicalization has quite a few unique psychological features that have been covered in the literature. The first is critical significance, and this is potentially a weak point in a lot of the empowerment work, that radicalization and radical messaging is quite specific on talking about critical significance and the need to be someone, to mean something in society. And when you have limited pathways for pro-social social change, it's hard to solidify, you being someone, you being a young person who can be and mean something. If your really limited options in society are, empowerment means getting a job. And while that's important, it also requires a very, very different and specific level of intervention on conveying the meaning and the significance in that type of life, where you're not going to necessarily have a heroic role. I remember a really important quote. A young friend from Syria whose cousin is involved in an extremist group, he told me, He said, it's really, really, really hard to convince anyone that being a refugee and sitting in a camp all day is any sort of sacrifice for Syria, for our society. So it's really difficult as empowerment practitioners. How do we convey what seems like idle time or frustrated agency as some sort of meaningful process for young people? It's really hard to do. Second, grievance. There's a lot of literature on what's called collective relative deprivation, which means that basically me and my group perceive ourselves as somehow having gotten less of a share than other groups that are different or slightly dissimilar from us. And a lot of this research came out of the Netherlands and looking at comparisons between Dutch citizens of Turkish origin and Moroccan origin, and how even slight perceptions of, the other Sunni Muslim group who has been treated better by Dutch society. There's a lot of strong data and different structural equation modeling linking that to desire for retribution, tendencies for collective action, willingness for violent defense of that group. And attitudes towards in-group defense was a function of not objective issues of comparative deprivation, but perceived deprivation, even if the socioeconomic indicators were indicating relative equality between two groups. The third common feature in a lot of the radicalization literature is on identity threat, and importantly, the social brain, different parts of the mesolimbic structures and reptilian structures, amygdala, hypothalamus, etc., do not necessarily process physical threats to safety differently from identity threats. It's a unique function of the human brain that we use the same architecture and systems to deal with any and all kinds of threats, irrespective of their nature. So it's important to note that identity threats do actually have a serious physiological role. And lastly, social belonging. There's vast literature on social belonging that indicates that belonging is also a motivation that can trump a whole other set of normative or ethical factors. A sense of threat to one's in-group naturally facilitates the intensification of that identity, and you can look at multiple longitudinal studies from social identity theory for that. And a lot of people, especially who are in low power or high powerlessness contexts, tend to derive much larger sense of their identity from the group, especially if the group that they belong to is perceived as agentic or efficacious in some way. And also in the context of intensification of group identity, you do see the moving and shifting of norms and of empathy and dehumanization of outgroups. So it's something that you see in a lot of the neuroimaging literature on threat reducing empathic capacities towards outgroups. One way to think of this that I found very, very helpful was to look at radicalization or radicalism as motivational scaffolding. In that sense, it's a state that can facilitate but does not necessarily cause the adoption of violence. In that sense, it could be compared also to the back end of a web platform. You can have all the code set up, but you still don't have the pretty website. There's still some trappings that need to come to make that next step. Radicalization or radicalism does create some tailored heuristics and pathways that might, for example, consolidate or intensify the perceptions of identity threats, or would intensify the nature of belonging to a specific group. And scaffolding, like many other processes, is something that is built faster in groups. So I really like this terminology around motivational scaffolding. I think it's helpful because it's something that applies equally to empowerment and radicalization, I think, and that both of them provide the motivational scaffolding for certain types of behaviors that can be positive or tremendously destructive. So the working definition we developed for radicalization here was it's a cognitive and psychosocial process whereby an individual undergoes an alteration of beliefs, values, demands, and actions, possibly including the use of violence, gains agency and conviction, and gradually adopts a more active and counter-normative identity and ideology to bring about transformative social change that aligns with his or her cause. Now, empowerment and radicalization do share some common elements here in this definition. I would say that empowerment is usually not counter-normative, but it does involve components of conviction, of increasing identification of identity, of group belonging, and of increasing willingness to use intense means in dedication to your cause. So there's a general pathway of radicalization and empowerment both being I change as an individual, we change, And that can mean us, our group, or us, our society. And then radicalization has this unique third component where it does have this sort of compulsion to promote that change or project that change onto other individuals in line with your specific worldview. So it's I change, we change, and radicalization has this notion of we also change them, which I think is a key feature. Both of them, the central concept that we were looking at in both theories is around agency. Agency obviously has an important role in both of these processes as an individual becomes more radicalized and becomes more empowered. There's a certain, there's few things that confer agency to an individual more than putting a gun in their hand. And I know that's quite a bold thing to say, but in terms of what it does to the sense of self-efficacy, and the dopamine and oxytocin circuitry in terms of increasing decreasing the distance of getting your reward. Putting a gun into someone's hand makes it really easy to activate reward sensitivity measures in the brain. And I'm not saying that it is a form of empowerment, but I'm saying that it is quite agentic in the moment to have a gun in your hand. Of course, in the long term, it leads to a lot of other antisocial and negative processes like shame and guilt, etc. But all of that is to say that it is important to analyze systems and structures and policies when we look at agency, because external structures influence tremendous control over the degree to which an individual can exercise their agency. Whether or not you have the assets and skills does not change the fact of the policy and or restrictive environment you're in to do that. Let's think of the context of Syrian refugees living in Jordan, who can go through quite good job training programs, yet they are not allowed by the Ministry of Labor to work in anything other than a select number of blue-collar jobs. So if there's a frustrated sense of that agency, how empowering are the structures that are around them, and what structural things need to be taken into account in terms of really making systems and programs promoting progressive agency of young people. Naturally, the nature of the methods of radicalized and empowered individuals is less relevant for our purpose of study than talking about the needs fulfilled by the processes. And when we're looking at the commonalities between the two processes, we're really focusing on motivations and needs, obviously not on outcomes, because those are vastly different in terms of when a young person goes through an empowerment type of process or goes through a radicalization process, because in the long run, being involved in extremist or terrorist organizations is not necessarily empowering because of what it leads to in terms of reprisal, incarceration, social ostracism, etc. Importantly, the key point here that I was trying to make with the gun example is that, not fulfilling that need for agency and for belonging does increase the likelihood that youth will seek that power or seek, agency via other conferring parties. If it's not the state, if it's not local government, if it's not NGOs, there is going to still be a frustrated and unfulfilled need that will be met in some way, or that people will still be seeking to meet in some way, shape, or form. Now, to summarize the common ground between these two phenomena, we could say that radicalization have in common that they're both, inherently about the development and the performance of agency. So developing the necessary skills to feel like an agent of change for yourself and your community, and also pathways and opportunities to perform that sense of agency. We could say that both are psychosocial processes, implying that there's a before and an after and different points for intervention along that path. Both radicalization and empowerment are fueled by social bonds and networks, highly linked to the evolutionary need to belong and our derivation of agency from group belonging and social supports. Both radicalization and empowerment in practice are usually linked to a new and shared vision in the target individual. Whatever type of program they go through, there's usually a process of instilling cognitive alternatives. In empowerment programs, it might be the restoration of vocational or social aspirations after going through a long process of feeling disempowered. And in radicalization, it might be opening a new cognitive alternative to seeing a different hierarchy for society, a different normative environment where your particular group is running the show. And of course, the value orientation of both radicalization and empowerment is linked to highly valuing self-actualization, self-reflection, and social change. Of course, the nature of that actualization and reflection is different in radical groups versus in empowerment contexts, but there is still a stated value orientation around social change and self-reflection. And some key distinctions herein between these two phenomena are that youth that are met by empowerment frameworks are approached very much in an asset building model, whereas youth met by counter-radicalization frameworks are often approached in a deficit or risk mitigation model. Originally, a lot of the funding for CVE work was naturally linked to security structures and security approaches. And it's been a bit of a slow and painful transition in moving away from that to more of the positive development frameworks also being applied to CVE. And I'm really grateful to Youth Power for championing that. Secondly, the self-actualization associated with empowerment is usually not stigmatized or counter-normative, whereas the self-actualization associated with radicalism, or violent radicalism particularly, is usually highly stigmatized and risks punitive response from state structures. And lastly, radicalization is what Ari Kruglansky calls counter-final in its nature, in that whereas empowerment naturally leads to life-giving outcomes for the self, radicalization, and particularly violent radicalization, is willing to use death as a tactic, is willing to use suicide as a tactic, and being dead is a very non-agentic state. And that's a blunt and crass way to put it, but that's the fundamental point, that the end game of violent radicalization is actually quite counter-final to its stated nature of giving a person a sense of agency. Anyways, so some recommendations here for programming, and then I'll turn it over to Kyle. Some concrete ways that organizations can leverage what we know about these two processes from a psychosocial lens. The first is that empowerment programs should absolutely focus on agency conferral in a deliberate way and find a delicate way to push system change. And I'd advocate looking at the theory of Forrest Tyler here on pro-social development and the inherent link between pursuing individual change while also systemic and institutional change. Secondly, empowerment programs should here recognize and work with grievances. And this is a huge weak point, at least in a lot of the youth programs that I've seen in the Middle East. Whenever a grievance is addressed, automatically young people are securitized and put in a preventive framework. If they are complaining about something, it is going to become a protest, is going to become an Arab Spring moment, is going to be met with violent response. So that chain has moved so far back to a knee-jerk reaction of that we don't necessarily know what to do with grievances. And as NGOs, we're put in a position where dealing with and articulating and conveying up those grievances puts us in a delicate position to vis-a-vis line ministries that we have to work with. But we do need to find a way to deal with those grievances and recognize them as normal, natural, and positive impulses towards change. The third is that empowerment programs should deliberately cultivate social bonds. I remember working in a refugee camp in the Middle East that shall not be named, and having a discussion around forming youth parliaments, youth governments at a sort of neighborhood level. And one of the things that I was told by the security sector was, if you mobilize youth, you can't control the outcome. And so that was their main reason for not wanting us to mobilize youth in any way, because there's tremendous power when you bring people together. And that is manifested even on a cellular level, which is the level at which I usually study it. Fourth, CVE programs should move to approaches that not just prevent and counter, but that really focus on asset cultivation and positive youth development. How can you engage with individuals that are already radicalized? And by having a deeper understanding of some of those impulses and what they mean on a psychological level, leverage that state and that impulse towards an alternative pathway while not necessarily forcing someone to abandon their tendency or proneness towards high commitment to a cause. And lastly, empowerment programs should deliberately try to measure concepts of agency, belonging, and critical significance where possible. And this is where a lot of my work at Beyond Conflict comes in trying to give new tools and measures more from cognitive social neuroscience to practitioners who are working in youth development spaces. And with that, I think I can turn it over to Kyle.
Hi. This is Maria again. Thank you, Mike. You've definitely given us a lot to think about and also a lot to discuss about. We have Jen Haig on our call also, who is our co-champion for our community of practice on youth in peace and development and peace and security. And we also have Patrick Young on our call, who is our other new co-champion for this community of practice. So I will give Jen a moment to provide a few comments, and then we'll also ask Patrick if he has any comments, and then we'll answer questions. Please post your questions in the chat section on the screen, and we will get to those questions during the call, and those questions that we can't answer on the call, we will provide some written answers later. So, Jen?
Hi, everybody. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah?
Okay, cool. Thank you, Mike, for the excellent presentation. I am one of the lucky ones who have already been able to read this full report, and as an academic, I will say it stands up. The lit review is excellent, and I think you did a really good job contending with really laden words in our field, and that's what we can see in this really vibrant discussion that's happening on the side here in the chat. So I'm going to try to keep it really short because I think everybody's got their own idea of what is empowerment, what is radicalization, and the way that you present it here is a really powerful concept for us to chew on. I really appreciate, first of all, that you talk about radicalism and radicalization as not inherently negative, and making these links. I think that's really important. I would caution to be careful at times. I think when we talk about radicalization, not just in this presentation, but actually much more so in other radicalization conversations, we tend to refer to it as a process. And one thing that we know from complexity science is that, there are multiple pathways of change. There's not just one process. And so I think we can sometimes follow this red herring in our programming to think, okay, well, if we interrupt this step in the process of radicalization, we've done our jobs. But really, from complexity science, we know that these processes are generally knowable only in retrospect, and that the pace of change is really dramatically different from person to person. So one person could, have a dramatic event happen, wake up the next day, and have been totally radicalized, again, for good or bad. Whereas for somebody else, it might take years. And so that's a layer of complexity here. I also, when I'm looking at the Venn diagram, I love how there's this overlap between empowerment and radicalization, but I would also say that empowerment is much bigger. I would make that circle much bigger, because empowerment can incorporate so many things that aren't necessarily a radical point of view, again, without attaching any normative description onto radicalization there. And also, just from a CVE perspective, a point I think I've been making for a while now is that radicalization and recruitment into violent extremist organizations are not the same thing. And in fact, we have a lot of people who, as you point out, are radicalized but not violent. And the flip side is also true. There's a lot of people who join these groups for reasons that have nothing to do with any kind of radical beliefs. And I actually, to use an example here, spoke with some Kenyans who were talking about some Kenyan youth who were returning from Somalia. And they had gone to Somalia for reasons that had to do with mainly with income, and lack of ability to support their family from Kenya, and they had all these promises that were made to them by Shabab, so they go to Somalia, and that youth worker said people are radicalized on their way out, and by that he meant when they are looking to leave, they need to kind of justify their actions to themselves, and then, so they start buying into the ideology as they're exiting the situation in order to kind of live with themselves afterwards. And so for me, this is a really great deep dive into this process of radicalization and how it looks like empowerment. But from a CVE perspective, I would also caution that that is only one part of that bigger Venn diagram of recruitment. So I know there's tons of questions and a really vibrant Q&A going on. That is kind of my first set of comments. Mike, I would love to hear from you on any of that. And also Kyle, if we get there, I would love for you to preview, if possible, the next phases of this research, because you mentioned Nigeria, and I would love to hear what's going on there. So thanks to everybody.
Thanks.
So Jen, I'll just jump in really quickly. Naturally, as always, I agree with everything you're saying, and I do think that the empowerment circle is bigger. Of course, and I think that your comments, or the best way to answer your comments and questions is really to go into something that I see Kurt is saying here on the side, around, the fact that I think an empowerment mindset, or an individual perceiving as themselves as empowered, does encompass a very, very different level of perceived change, or what they can change. Whereas I think a lot of radicalism tends to focus on system levels or system change. Kurt brings up a good point that empowerment can also take a sense of changing other individuals around you. I think that the default response in a lot of young people is, I need to change you in order for things to change for me, instead of thinking about, I can heal you, and in that process heal me. This is where I know Kurt does a lot of work in the notion of creating communities of wounded healers as a path to empowerment, because in a context where a young person is really not going to have the chance to change the system, and the system is going to be obstinate and non-responsive, one of the best things you can do to engage individuals that are particularly obstinate or themselves not responsive is to put them in charge of other young people that they see that are suffering differently or in different ways than them. We've seen tremendous evidence for that in Jordan and Germany, Lebanon, Syria, elsewhere, that really giving young people not just a sense of role in their community, but a role in forming and healing other individuals around them, can really remove that sense of locus of control away from an external locus of control of your life to more of an internal locus of control. And I don't necessarily think radicalism or radicalization in the conventional sense ever forces people to move that locus of control internally. I think it stays on external and structural factors, because those are easy scapegoats.
Thank you, Mike. And actually, I was reading some of the questions, and you kind of have answered some of the questions already. So one of them was here about what are your recommendations for ensuring work to develop youth agency in a way that pushes for underlying systems change that addresses the structures that create the conditions? I think you've addressed a little bit, but if either Kyle or you want to add to that. And then a similar question, how do you recommend, or do you recommend this at all, engaging the radicalized youth in empowerment programs when they may have no interest in changing the current belief sets and attitudes? And I think you've hinted again a little bit at that with your previous answer, but perhaps if you and Kyle want to add and perhaps expand on your comments.
Yeah, I'll turn it over to Kyle in a second, and I'll just add a little bit on each one. In terms of Ellen's question on engaging radical individuals, I think absolutely. I think it would be a mistake as CVE or PVE practitioners to not do that. We look at a lot of work in the United States in different youth mentoring programs. My family's from Guatemala, where we have a lot of gang violence prevention work. And it would be like saying, let's do gang violence prevention without engaging former members in the process. I mean, that wouldn't be done. Or without even engaging current gang members in the process. No, it's very common to do that. And I don't think we should shy away from it just because, of course, there's a lot of legal issues. But I think conceptually we can't shy away from it. And I just think it requires a different type of training for individuals who are going to engage. And on Christina's question, what are ways that we can create youth's agency while also pursuing structural change? I think we have to think about what are the things that the system is going to say about youth to justify their continued disenfranchisement. One would be they don't understand how the system works, or their complaints are not valid because they don't understand how it works. Okay, let's have them understand how it works. When I was doing a recent, or not recent, it was 5 years ago, working in northern Jordan, there was a group of young Syrians and Jordanians that kept complaining about the water being contaminated and saying that the NGOs are contaminating the water for the Syrians and they're giving the good water to the Jordanians, blah, blah, blah. So we said, okay, boys, let's train you up in participatory research. Let's go out into the community, take pictures, do a small participatory rapid appraisal, and bring the findings to the people in charge of water. So I had access to Oxfam and different NGOs that were working in the water structures at the time. And by the time the report was written and the youth had a meeting with that director of Oxfam and a local engineer, they changed their tune dramatically because they realized that a lot of what they were basing their anger on was rumor. So you find, and they also still had some very justified anger, but it was based and rooted in facts and evidence, which is something that the state never expects from angry youth, to deal with them in their own game. So let's find the ways that the system is going to disenfranchise youth or make excuses about them, and find ways to circumvent that. I think those need to be integrated into empowerment approaches.
Yeah, so I'll just say quickly, completely agree with Mike. This is, I think, one of my biggest frustrations in the CVE space is not only do we not engage with those we most need to engage with, but we have hurdles and legal obstacles to doing it, and it just seems like we're shooting ourselves in the foot, particularly when we get to a phase of the conflict like Nigeria. We're talking a 9-year insurgency, counterinsurgency, territory largely, won back by regional forces in the Nigerian military, but we don't have the ability to engage with communities to facilitate reintegration and rehabilitation. And so it handicaps our ability. And I would say, one of the problems of this is the entire construct of terrorism and violent extremism. We put individuals in almost a mystical category where we deny our natural tools, abilities, criminal justice systems, other frameworks for engaging with conflict as conflict and peacebuilding practitioners. And we just sort of say, this is why CVE, PVE basically draws a line that when people are radicalized or engaged in an armed group, we don't have a good answer for what we as practitioners are going to do to engage them or support their disengagement in an empowering way in particular. And so I think we have to get rid of some of these constructs and languages, definitely engage directly. Quickly to Christina's question, I think Mike answered it well, but one of the things I also get frustrated about with CVE is there's such a focus on the external, actions of individuals who are quote-unquote radicalized, armed opposition groups in Nigeria, for example, and there's such a weak analysis by systems and power holders who drive conflict, and a lack of opportunities for us as NGOs, militaries who play a role, or governments to acknowledge their contribution to a conflict in terms of the structural and systemic grievances and marginalization. And so we have to find ways within CVE to internalize our own historical responsibility, whether it's as the U.S. military government or the governments like the government of Nigeria we support, not to point fingers, name, and shame, but to have a more inclusive discussion. We have to all acknowledge our contribution, and I think that's where solutions come about, and that has to be done in a humanizing way where we're engaging those, not just dehumanizing them, putting them on the margins and speaking for them. I'll pass it back to Maria. I know we're short on time. We got a few questions.
Thank you. Patrick, I'm not sure if you're still on the call. Can you still hear us? And do you have any questions for our presenters?
Yes, I'm still on the call. But I first off, thank you for a wonderful presentation. For me, my question in regards to this presentation would be, what are some of the next steps? So you've outlined this type of framework. So in regards to the work that you're doing, how do you want to continue building capacity with youth?
Thanks, Patrick. Let me just say a quick word. So we have completed research in northern Nigeria, talked to 35 officially, or unofficially 22 officially Boko Haram members, former members, more women than men actually in this case study, this sample, to get a sense of how they feel empowerment and disempowerment in this radicalization journey that we as outsiders frame. And there are a lot of challenges. Many feel empowered and disempowered across their lives. A lot of people joined these groups to feel empowerment. When we spoke with them, they became very animated and excited, just speaking freely about their times as part of the group, in contrast to how disempowered they feel today, because this idea of off-ramps, alternative pathways, humanizing engagement of ex-combatants or formerly radicalized, it just doesn't exist. We talk about off-ramps, but we don't have them. And so that is our goal. Our goal is to identify, again, not using a deficit or risk based approach, but looking at the protective factors, the resilience, and the assets of these individuals. And even if they're a minority of individuals within the conflict, right, we understand our primary goal as an organization is still to build resilience, to promote social cohesion and peace, but that these individuals, even if they're a minority within a conflict, have an outsized impact on peace and stability in regions where these conflicts exist. So we are now looking at the recommendations that are coming out of the second report and the first report and trying to infuse them back into our programs and then figure out how we can do some advocacy around them to others, because the CVE space has obviously exploded. It's not going anywhere, and so we want to make sure that we're doing a better job and creating a stronger evidence base for how we're working our way out of conflicts, not just focus on the analysis of push-pull factors, the grievances, the drivers. This becomes an obsession with the pathology of a conflict, which is fine, but that's not really what we're here to do as peace builders. We have to not just ask what's wrong and how to fix it, but what's possible and how to create it. And I think that's the direction we're trying to move into. A small caveat I'll say about the research and how challenging it was in northeastern Nigeria is obviously a lot of people, particularly in Nigeria, are forcibly recruited. These are not people who voluntarily join groups necessarily. So what took a long time for us was identifying those individuals who, for ideological reasons, joined the group, and not those who necessarily became coerced or forcibly recruited or did it because of a duty to their family or threats to the security of their community, which was honestly very, very common. But anyway, I'll leave it at that. The report is fascinating, kind of a really in-depth insight into the minds of individuals who went through the engagement and disengagement around the insurgency in northern Nigeria. Any other questions that we want to get to before time?
I think we'll leave it at that. And thank you, Mike and Kyle. This is a really, really fascinating topic, and I think we've only really scratched the surface of this topic. I can't wait for your next report and really look forward to that. We'll definitely have a webinar about the second report too, and hope that you will all join us. And between now and then, what you can do next is, join us on Twitter, join our community of practice. If you haven't been on the community of practice yet, you can join us by just going to youthpower.org and use the resources. The report is published there. And you can also, if you have materials yourself that you want us to post on youthpower.org, you can just send it to us and we will get it up on the website. So thanks again to our wonderful speakers. Thanks to Jen and Patrick. And we hope to see you on our next webinar.
Just a quick note, please reach out to Mike or me directly if you have comments, questions. These are obviously new ideas we're developing. We are welcome to feedback, critiques, and look forward to continuing these discussions. Thanks.
And we will send your contact information when we send out the link to the recordings. So all of this is recorded and we will make it available. And so you can get in touch with Kyle and Mike. Thanks again.